You can question everything.
Everything?
Everything.
Everything.
Yeah, everything.
Split it.
What answers are you looking for?
Why are we here?
What happens if we die?
I want to know what's out there.
Is there a God?
Do you believe in the devil?
I believe in science.
This can't be true.
Seek, and you will find.
Knock, and the door will be open.
What?
I'm afraid to ask. I was afraid to ask.
You must be brave.
You know, the sold answer.
Oh, really?
Are there any questions?
Any questions?
Any questions?
Any questions?
Well, good morning. It is good to see you. We're in week 2 of our series, Any Questions, where a couple of weeks ago, we just asked you guys to send in any questions that you had about faith or about Christianity, about Jesus, about the world. And you guys sent over 200 questions. We are not going to have a chance to get to all of them in this series. We gave you some categories to think about these questions, and one of the categories was faith and science. And so today, I'm going to take a few of the questions that you sent in around faith and science. I actually wrote a sermon that's about 3 times longer than what I have time to show you today. So there's a lot on the cutting room floor. There's a few questions that we may do later as like a special YouTube feature because I've already done it. I just need to like record it. I just realized first hour, even after cutting it a lot, I still had too much. So I cut it way back. For this hour, this will be fairly streamlined, but there's just so much to talk about. Before we jump in, I want to remind you or let you know maybe for the first time, if you're new around here, the baptism is happening here on June 30th. So throughout this question series, if there's something you hear us talk about that makes you feel like maybe Jesus is more compelling than you thought he was, or Christianity seems to have more validity than you assumed it did, it's possible that your next step needs to be baptism, to show people that you would like to make Jesus the Lord of your life. If you've been wanting to do that, or if over the next week or two you decide you want to do that, June 30th is your next time to do that, and we would love for you to. vervecity.church, you can sign up and let us know that you would like to be baptized, and we'll let you know all the information about what that looks like so that you can come confident in what you'll need to do that day. Okay, so this series, any questions? I'm just going to jump right in. I want to let you know at the beginning the same thing I said last week, which is just a reminder that obviously I'm answering these questions from the perspective of a Christian. So last week we looked a lot about life after death. Obviously not everyone agrees about these things, but I'm a follower of Jesus, and so I try to root my answers in the teachings of Jesus and the teachings of the Scripture that he taught us were authoritative and that taught us revealed God to us. And so that's the perspective I'm starting with. There is a passage I want us to just look at in those Scriptures at the beginning here from Romans chapter 1. This is the Apostle Paul writing, one of the very first Christians, and he says this: "They know the truth about God because he has made it obvious to them. For ever since the world was created, people have seen the earth and sky. And through everything God made, they can clearly see his invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature, so they have no excuse for not knowing God." What Paul says and what we see echoed throughout the New Testament is simply this idea that God reveals himself to us in a couple of major ways. One is his divine revelation of himself through Jesus and eventually the Scriptures. And the other is his natural self-revelation, that you can look around and see, the Apostle Paul believed, something of the power of God by what we see in the earth and the sky. That there's something in nature that reveals God to us. And so I believe that faith and science actually handshake pretty well, which brings us to our first question: does science affirm or contradict Christianity? I like the question because it seems to kind of assume that science is either going to affirm it, and for some people might say prove it, or that it's going to contradict Christianity. And maybe you, like me, grew up in a church environment, or maybe you didn't. But at some point along the way, many of us, in our conversations with other Christians, or in just what we've seen the church do out in the world, we've decided that for many Christians, they believe they have to choose between being faithful to the Bible and being a believer in science. Because like the church I grew up in as a kid, in many aspects was a great church. But I remember lots of adults making little side comments about how unreliable science was. Like they didn't necessarily believe that science gave us a very accurate picture of the world. Or they would tear down things like evolution or an old earth idea because they were just very suspicious of science. And so I grew up thinking, not because anyone ever explicitly told me this, but I grew up thinking that to be faithful to Jesus and to have a high view of the Scripture was to be very suspicious of science. Then I get into college, and one of the things that sent me on a faith crisis, where I had to really determine what I believed, was finding out that lots of what I'd been told about the unreliability of science when I was younger wasn't true. and that the scientific process actually had a lot I could learn from and it would teach me, and that we could understand the world better through it. And so then I felt like I was in this place where I had to make a choice between undeniable science, I mean, the evidence for it was just overwhelming, or unreliable religion. I was in a religious tradition that had told me things about science that weren't true, and so it seemed unreliable to me. And so as a kid, I was handed a version of Christianity that was highly suspicious of science. And I imagine some of you were handed that as kids also, or that you've been exposed to it as adults. And kind of this version of Christianity, whether it says it explicitly or it implies it, this is what you feel like it says: quit thinking, start believing. Like when you start to think, that's a real problem. So it leads to people like renowned atheist Richard Dawkins saying things like this: one of the truly bad effects of religion is that it teaches us that it is a virtue to be satisfied with not understanding. And I don't think that Christianity actually teaches this. In fact, the Apostle Paul tells us to weigh the evidence when we're trying to determine whether Jesus actually rose from the dead or not. So Christianity is not opposed to science, and it's not opposed to evidence, but there are versions of Christianity that are opposed to science and are opposed to evidence. And so when Dawkins says this, I have no doubt that he's encountered Christians in the course of his life that have basically had this understanding, that they make a virtue of not understanding. And you've heard this too. Someone might ask the question like, okay, well, if the Bible is to be taken seriously, is the world really just really young? Is it only a few thousand years old? And if so, what do we do with evolution? And what do we do with dinosaurs? And what do we do with starlight that takes billions of years to get to us? What do we do with all these things? And you'll have people say to us things like, oh dear, God's ways are not our ways. His thoughts are not our thoughts. It's all a mystery. Don't worry so much about it. These are what we call thought-terminating cliches. It's a cliche that you say in order to get people to stop thinking. What about this? What about that? What about that? Oh, don't worry about it. God's ways are bigger than our ways. His thoughts are bigger than our ways. There's no way that you, puny human, can possibly understand. God is mysterious. Here's the rub. God is mysterious. But saying that God is mystery doesn't mean he's unknowable. It means that he's endlessly knowable. And so there's always more to discover as you dig down, another layer, another layer, another layer. So my encouragement to you is to not see faith as this, that it's a virtue to not understand. God seems to call us into understanding. But it's this understanding, it's like this version of Christianity that has led people like Neil deGrasse Tyson, a very famous astrophysicist. He says this: as religion is now practiced and science is now practiced, there is no intersection between the two. That is for certain. And it's not for want of trying. Over the centuries, many people, theologians as well as scientists, have tried to explore points of intersection. And anytime anyone has declared that harmony has risen up, it is the consequence of religion acquiescing to scientific discovery in every single case. In other words, what he's saying here is, look, science as they're practiced now and religion are not compatible. There's just no overlap. And anytime anyone ever thinks there is overlap, it's really just a matter of religion kowtowing, acquiescing to science. That's always how it is. Now, look, I love Neil deGrasse Tyson. He did the Cosmos series a few years ago. He's a great interview on late night talk shows. He used to be a wrestler. I don't know if you've ever seen him when he was younger, but he was like swole. So like, I love Neil deGrasse Tyson. I'm a fan. He's wrong about this. I mean, some of the very first scientists were Christians who believed that if we worship a good, powerful, logical, consistent God, then we ought to find a universe that is logical and consistent. And so they went about studying it, believing that it could possibly be taken apart and understood better. Like, their faith inspired their scientific curiosity. It didn't dampen it. And unfortunately, for many people living, especially in the United States, and we'll talk about why in a little bit, in the 21st century, we think that our faith is supposed to dampen our scientific curiosity. But in fact, it is faith that spurred scientific curiosity on for hundreds of years. And so I think he's off on this. But I do agree with him that I understand why he would assume that science and faith as practiced today seem totally opposite. But I just believe this, that God or science, making that choice, like, it's a false alternative. You don't have to choose between the two, because the two do some overlapping, but largely they're answering different questions. Stephen Jay Gould, a scientist, he writes this: each subject, science and faith, has a legitimate magisterium or domain of teaching authority. And these magisteria do not overlap. He's saying like they each talk about a different domain, and he doesn't think that they're overlapping. I think they are a bit, but not a ton. He says this. The principle that he's going to call this, by the way, is to designate it is noma, or non-overlapping magisteria. We're going to call it noma because non-overlapping magisteria is too long. All right, so we're going to continue. The net of science covers the empirical universe. This is what science does. It says this. What is it made of, and why does it work this way? So fact and theory. The net of religion extends over questions of moral meaning and value. These two magisteria do not overlap, nor do they encompass all inquiry. He goes on to talk about, for instance, art and beauty are not really covered by these two things. But here's my basic highlight of what I think he's saying here. Science answers the questions how and when. How did this happen? When did it happen? How old is it, right? All those kinds of questions. Faith answers the questions who and why. Who's behind this? Why does this happen? Why are you here? What's the purpose of your life? It's those kinds of questions. And because they are asking different questions, they are compatible with one another, but they don't have to like clash against one another. There are historical reasons why we think that they do here in the US, but they don't have to. So to this question, right, does science affirm or contradict Christianity? I would say this: science can't prove Christianity. It's not possible for science to prove it. It's not possible for it to disprove it either, but it certainly can't prove it. But yeah, I would say this: science can support Christianity. Science can support it. Here's what I mean by this. There are elements of faith and practice within the Christian church that if you just scientifically approach them, you'll see that there is a kind of truth to them, even if you're highly skeptical about whether Christianity is true or not. So there was a man a few years ago named Mike McHargue. His nickname is Science Mike. It'd be weird if Mike's nickname was Science Mark. His nickname was Science Mike, and he wrote a list of axioms of faith. In other words, what could he know about faith that's objectively true, even to someone who's skeptical? It doesn't take faith to believe his axioms of faith. So he tried to approach it in a scientific way. And I think in that way, these axioms are helpful because they support Christianity, even though they don't prove it. So I'll just give you a few examples. He wrote a bunch of these. We don't have time for all of them. Here's a few. He says this: Jesus is at least a man so connected to moral and spiritual health that he was called the Son of God, and the largest religious movement in human history is centered around his teachings. Even if this is all Jesus is, following his teachings can promote peace, empathy, and genuine morality. Now, look, I think Jesus was way more than this, but I told you, I'm answering these questions from a Christian perspective. If you aren't sure what you think about faith, I think you should give us at least this, that this is at least who Jesus is, which means studying him can be beneficial for you, and putting his teachings into practice can be beneficial, even if you're not sure you believe all the claims that Christians make about him. We say this here often at Verve City Church, that we believe that Jesus will make your life better and make you better at life. And I think that this is borne out. Here's another one. Sin is at least volitional action or inaction that violates one's own understanding of what is moral. Sin comes from the divergent impulses between our lower and higher brain functions and our evolution-driven tendency to do things that serve ourselves and our tribe. Let me make that a little bit more layman for us. We have higher and lower brain functions, okay? Oftentimes, psychologists will refer to this as the elephant and the rider. The elephant is your lower brain function. It's what you really crave at your base level. The rider is the more thinking, kind of long-term planning part of you. It's called an elephant and a rider because the elephant is huge and has a lot of weight and starts barreling in a certain direction, and your higher brain function rider tries to direct it, but it's very hard to. So the elephant, for instance, let's say that you want to work out and eat really healthy for 6 months so that you have a really great beach bod by the time that July rolls around, okay? So that was the plan. So that's your rider. That's what your higher brain function wants. But your lower brain function wants to eat that entire box of donuts, okay? So that's the elephant and the rider. That's the mismatch. And so your rider is trying to get the elephant to stay away from the donuts, but it's very, very hard, all right? So you have a morality around this as well. For instance, most of you would probably say that you really believe, and you would mean it, you believe that lying is wrong. That's your rider, that's your higher brain function. You believe lying is wrong. But if you find yourself in a situation, either relationally or maybe at work, where a little lie would get you out of a lot of trouble or smooth over the relationship, you may find yourself drawn to, tempted to, you may find yourself lying without even giving a lot of thought to it. It just kind of flows out of you. And even in retrospect, you're like, why did I do that? It's because your lower brain function was like, we got to get out of trouble. We got to save this thing. Just blah, problem solved, right? But your higher brain function struggles with that. So what he's saying is like, sin is at least this, right? Sin is at least the distance between what we know we should do and what we actually do. It's at least that. And even if you are not a Christian, even if you are not sure that faith is real at all, you've seen this in the world. You know you don't always do what you know to do. You know you've done things that have unnecessarily broken trust or broken relationships. And he's saying sin is at least that. And even if this is all sin is, it's destructive and it threatens human flourishing. All right, one more, just because I think these are helpful. He says this prayer is at least a form of meditation that encourages the development of healthy brain tissue, lowers stress, and can connect us to God. And even if that is a comprehensive definition of prayer, the health and psychological benefits of prayer justify the discipline. Look, we know from studying this, it's objectively true, scientifically proven, that prayer and meditation make your brain tissue healthier, give you less stress. In fact, having faith, people of faith are happier than people who don't have faith. These things are just objectively true. That doesn't mean that faith is real. It doesn't prove Christianity exists. But it does mean it might be helpful to at least try these things and see where they get you. Prayer, for instance. Like some of you may have never prayed or you don't really pray often. I just want to encourage you, maybe tonight, try praying. Because even if you're very skeptical of all this, like prayer has benefits. That's objectively true. And so maybe tonight, you're laying in bed as you're about to fall asleep. And look, if you don't know people who are Christians, if people are maybe antagonistic toward faith, your friends are, and like you'd be embarrassed for them to find out you prayed, just keep it to yourself. You don't have to tell anybody, okay? This is just you. But maybe tonight as you're about to fall asleep, maybe just say the word out loud. Maybe you just say the word for God that Jesus used of him when he prayed, which is Father. Father. And then you could just speak out loud what happened today for you, what you were thinking, different parts of the day, as if there were a loving person in the room who wanted to hear from you. And then close it out. Amen. You could just try that. Or maybe like a whole prayer feels too much and too intimidating. You just want to, maybe with hands open tonight, just say the word, Father. And imagine in your mind the best version of Father. Maybe on this Father's Day, praying to the best Father would be something that you would find helpful and healthy. Because prayer is at least these things. And even if this is all it is, the health and psychological benefits of prayer justify the discipline. Look, I think prayer and Jesus and sin are far more than any of these things. But if you're just talking about like where science fits in, I think that science doesn't prove Christianity, but it does support it. And it's worth then considering Christianity because of the support that science lends if you are a skeptical person. And I get it. Faith's never come easy for me. I am by nature a skeptical person. So if that's you, please know I get it. I'm with you. I understand. And yet still, when I actually tried it, when I stuck a toe, like this was good. And I think it might be good for you too. All right, next question. Next question you guys asked. What do we not know about God and the universe? How much time do we have? What do we not know about God and the universe? So much. Okay, next question. Are humans the only living beings in the universe? Are humans the only living beings in the universe? And I took this to mean like obviously we know there are other living beings on Earth besides just humans, right? You've been to a zoo before, so I imagine that you've seen this, right? But I took this to mean, are there other humanoid, intelligent life out there? Like space aliens is what I took you to be asking this. So first of all, I think it's hilarious that you think I would know this. I don't know. I don't know if there are space aliens, okay? But secondly, if you ever saw the X-Files, I mean, I want to believe, right? Like, that sounds fun. But I don't know. Like, space is a really, really big place. When I was a kid growing up, I remember that they tried to take passages out of the book of Ezekiel, which is a really weird prophetic book and kind of close to the middle of the Old Testament. They tried to take passages out of Ezekiel, these visions that Ezekiel had, to say that what Ezekiel actually saw was space aliens. And 9-year-old me thought that was probably true and very fascinating. As I got older, I learned, oh no, that's a type of prophetic literature, and that was very symbolic, and it wasn't about space aliens at all. And then Ezekiel was a lot less interesting. But then later I learned more about Ezekiel, and it got more interesting again, but for different reasons. There were still no space aliens. So anyway, I don't know if there are space aliens. It's a fascinating question, and I'm sure we could talk about it in the lobby afterwards if you'd want to. I'd be happy to hear your theories, probably, but I'll only have a few minutes. So if you have like a 45-minute space alien pitch, maybe cut it to 3. Okay, so here's another question. How can a scientist interpret the book of Genesis pertaining to how the world was created, and how does evolution relate to the Bible? We'll actually spend the rest of our time this morning focusing on this particular question because I think we have probably different kinds of people in the room. And for some of you, what we talk about in the next few minutes is maybe going to feel like 101, and I get that. So I would ask, can you please give me some space this morning for those who this won't feel like 101 at all, because I think it would be helpful for them to know it. And then we have lots more questions you asked around this topic that we may put videos up in the next couple of weeks. We'll see what we have time to do. But I want to spend some time on this one because I think it deserves our time. Let me give you just kind of the overview. There are a lot of Christians in the United States today who have been taught that a faithful understanding of Genesis, the first book in the Bible, and especially the first 2 chapters of Genesis, means that you have to believe that the earth is between 6,000 and 10,000 years old and that evolution is wrong. And there are millions and millions of Christians in the U.S. who have been taught this since the time they were very young. I was taught that also when I was very young, okay? So please know that you may meet a Christian one day who's a very smart person, very bright, very faithful follower of Jesus, and talk to them. You may find out that this is a belief that they hold, that they were handed maybe at some point, and that they found that they had to hold to. What I want to say about that is that I want to have space for people who have all kinds of beliefs around the age of the earth and evolution, all that kind of stuff. These are all peripheral issues when it comes to Scripture, right? What's important, according to the Scriptures, is that God created, that he loves us, that he sent Jesus for us, that Jesus died and rose from the dead in order to reconnect us with God, for our relationship with him that sin had destroyed, and so that we could, he's remaking earth and heaven like right now, and will continue to do so throughout eternity, especially after Jesus returns. That's kind of like, I just summed up the Old and New Testament completely in about 30 seconds, okay? That's the big, important, like Nicene Creed, churches always stacked hands on, that kind of stuff. What we're talking about is specifically, how are you supposed to interpret Genesis 1 and 2? Okay, so we're taking all of Scripture and we're going to focus on this little bitty part over here for just a minute. And I just want you to know that for most of Christianity, those chapters were not understood by the church to be literal scientific depictions of how God created the earth or how long it took him to do it for most of church history. That started to change, especially in the U.S. in the 20th century. And we'll get to that in a minute. I want to quote to you a theologian from the 3rd century, one of the earliest church theologians ever. His name is Origen. He spells it with an E. It's not a typo. We know that normally Origen has 2 I's. All right, but here's what he wrote about Genesis 1 and 2. He says, "What person of intelligence, I ask, will consider as a reasonable statement that the first and second and the third day," Genesis 1 talks about creation in 6 days, and then on the 7th day, God rests. And so he's talking about the first 3 days of that account. The first, second, and the third day, in which there are said to be both morning and evening, existed without sun, moon, and stars, while the first day was even without a heaven. So morning and evening, God introduces on day 1 of creation, but the sun, moon, and stars aren't introduced until day 4. And so what he's trying to say is simply this. How could you look at this passage and see that light existed in day 1, day and night, but that the things that make light, sun, moon, and stars, don't exist till day 4? How could you look at that and think that that's a literal record of how God went about it? He goes on and says this: "I do not think anyone will doubt that these are figurative expressions which indicate certain mysteries through a semblance of history." Look, Origen's not alone in this. Thomas Aquinas believed this, that it was supposed to be figurative. Augustine believed it was supposed to be figurative. One of the, most influential theologians in the history of the church. John Wesley, the founder of the Methodist Church, believed this. Billy Graham believes that it's likely, or at least could be, figurative at the beginning. So for much of church history, that's how it was assumed to be. It was assumed that because the sun, moon, and stars weren't created till day 4, and you have day and night on day 1, that this was supposed to be a poetic expression of God's creation, as opposed to a scientific one. Because keep in mind, when the Bible was written, science was not a thing that existed. It is a pre-scientific book. It's not an anti-scientific book. It's just a pre-scientific book. Then in the fundamentalist movement that started in the United States at the end of the 19th century and going into the 20th century, in 1923, a book was written called The New Geology. It was written by a couple of people, neither of whom were actually geologists, who tried to prove that the earth could be mapped kind of using the flood data in the book of Genesis and say these were very literal stories. A few decades later, this book came out called The Genesis Flood, The Biblical Record and Its Scientific Implications by Whitcomb and Morris. And they tried to also say that the earth, like that Genesis 1 and 2 could be understood scientifically. And that these two things said something about the age of the earth and about evolution. And the thing they said about the age of the earth was that the earth was very young. And the thing that they said about evolution was that it was not possible given the biblical text, okay? So what I want to do for just a moment is talk about how we know kind of the age of the earth, how scientists would say we do, just a little bit. This is such a layman's overview of this stuff, right? We're not going to get deep into the weeds. I just want to give a few examples. And then also evolution, because I've heard a lot of pastors talk about evolution and usually very poorly. And I understand why, so we'll talk about that too in a minute. But I just want to talk about these things, the age of the earth and evolution. So how do we know? Like the reason that people think that Genesis 1 and 2, and Genesis in general, teach that the earth is very young is because they're following out the genealogies that happened in Genesis 1 through 5, okay? Adam's line, Adam and Eve's line. And I have a whole question you asked, were Adam and Eve real people? It's a great question. We don't have time to talk about it today, but maybe we'll put a video out on it, okay? So people follow that genealogy and they come to the conclusion that the earth is maybe only 6,000 years old. Now, there are lots of problems with this. Part of the problem is we know how fast light travels. Light travels at a very consistent speed. For instance, it takes about 8 minutes for the light from our sun to get to the earth. If the sun were to just black out right now and we were all standing outside, it would take 8 minutes for us to know that the sun blacked out. We wouldn't know it. It would take that long for it to actually reach us, okay? Which means when you look up at the sun, which by the way, don't do that unless you're wearing special lenses. But if you look up at the sun, what you see as you look at the sun, you're actually looking back in time. What you are seeing is what the sun looked like 8 minutes ago. Does this make sense? That's how long it takes for its light to travel here. So that's the sun. That is our closest star by far. Other stars are millions of light years away from us, billions of light years away from us, because we know how long it takes light to travel. So for instance, we know that the universe has been around for millions or billions of years now. In fact, most scientists believe between 13 and 14 billion years, in part because of the speed that light travels and how far out we can see. That's one of the evidences. Now, people would say, well, couldn't God have just created the whole universe, but he created it so that it looked like the universe was old, or that it looked like, so that light was already in progress. And it's like, I guess he could have done that. But also, God could have created all of us 10 seconds ago with a built-in memory. And just, he could have done that too. Why would he do that? Like, it feels a little deceptive. So yeah, sure, anything is possible, I guess, if we're talking about an omnipotent being. But the question that I think needs to kind of haunt us a little bit as we think through these things is, why would we necessitate that science has to be wrong about these things if the scripture doesn't necessitate that it be, right? I'm fine with questioning science, but a lot of times we are thrusting a new interpretation onto Genesis 1 and 2 that ancient Christians didn't have, and we're doing it now because I think a few people in the 20th century told us we had to. All right, so here's another one. If the earth is only a few thousand years old, we can actually pull ice cores out of like Antarctica. They look like this. And we can actually go through the ice and tell how many years old the ice is. Why? Well, because as seasons change, the sediment that we find in the layers of ice changes. So you can see how many summers, essentially, because summer is usually dustier, you can see how many summers a particular ice core has received. And we've drilled ice cores in the Arctic that have shown us at least 750,000 years of Earth history, okay? Now, I believe the Earth is much older than that. Most scientists believe it's around 4.6 billion years old. But we've got ice cores that go back hundreds of thousands of years. And while it doesn't tell us how old the entire Earth is, it does help us know that the Earth is much older than those books would have said that it is based on their understanding of Genesis 1 and 2. Francis Collins, who's a scientist and a Christian. In fact, we're going to hear from Francis Collins later on in this in our worship service today. Francis, he has amazing pedigree, and he oversaw the mapping of the entire human genome, all of our DNA, for the scientific project here in the United States. This is a brilliant scientist with a major pedigree. And this is what he says about the age of the earth. He says the clarity of this method, and he's specifically talking about drilling for ice, the ice coring method. The clarity of this method of dating is one of the reasons why scientists react so negatively to claims that the earth is less than 10,000 years old. An ice core with 500,000 seasonal summer layers of pollen can no more be 10,000 years old than a massive oak with 200 annual rings can be 2 years old, right? That's just how that works. So we have lots of evidence that would seem to suggest that the earth is very old. I know, again, this is just a very brief overview, but I just want to name that. So to say that it has to be very young, again, is the text actually pushing that? I don't think it is, but we'll talk about that in a minute. Then evolution. So they believe that the text would say that we can't believe in any form of evolution. And in fact, it turns out lots of Americans don't believe in evolution, distinctly. In the UK, it's like 9% who don't believe in evolution. But in the United States, it's about 44% that don't believe in evolution, something like that. So this is from the book, The Language of Science and Faith. By the way, if what we're talking about here is interesting to you, I cannot recommend this book more highly because this is written by Francis Collins and Carl Giberson, and they go through all the questions that people ask about faith and science and give much more detailed answers than we're able to do here on a single Sunday morning. But it's a fascinating book. You won't be bored with it. It's very interesting. If you find science interesting, you'll find the book interesting. This is one of the things they name in the book. A recent Gallup poll indicates that 44% of people in the United States believe God created humans in their present form fewer than 10,000 years ago. This belief, they write, grows more untenable with each passing day. The reason it grows untenable is because of the mountain of evidence we now have for evolution, for some form of evolution to be our best understanding of the way that human beings came to be. Now, I just want to talk about kind of a little bit for just a minute what that means, because I hear pastors say the craziest, most untrue things about the theory of evolution on a regular basis. In fact, I'll share with you a few of what those are. These are just things I've heard pastors say in our region, within a 10-mile radius of this campus over the last 5 years. These are just things I've heard. People have sent me clips. I've watched a few sermons. These are things I've heard them say. I've heard them say that, well, Darwin was wrong about almost everything, and most scientists are abandoning him. Well, Darwin was wrong about a few things, but you will not find scientists abandoning his major theory of evolution and natural selection. That's just not true. But the thing is, they read it in a few places. In fact, I'll give you the name of one website where they do a lot of their research, and some of you will be very familiar with it. There's a website called Answers in Genesis. It's run by a gentleman named Ken Ham. If you read through some of the articles on the website Answers in Genesis, you'll discover a couple of things. First of all, the lack of humility is pretty strong. There's a lot of condescension toward anyone who sees things differently than they do. Okay, that just comes out. I've rarely read an article that didn't shine through pretty clearly. The second thing is, if you do some research on the scientists who write for this publication, you'll find that most of them are very discredited amongst actual scientists. In fact, they start with the presupposition that Genesis 1 and 2 are to be taken literally and that the earth is only a few thousand years old. That's their starting place. And then they only look for science that would validate that, and they try to invalidate any science that would say otherwise. That's the whole mission. And they're very upfront about this. I'm not trying to project a thing onto them. They say this. I've been to they have a museum in Kentucky, the Creation Museum, and an Ark encounter. They rebuilt Noah's Ark in Kentucky. So you can go there and pay lots of money to see both of those things. They actually, I think they get their pricing instructions from Disneyland. It's very similar if you go to both. It's high, okay? And so these are good people who love the Lord, and I believe take the Bible very seriously. This is not a heart issue. But their starting place is Genesis 1 and 2 has to be literal. It has to be, days has to be 24 hours. Each day has to be 24 hours. And the genealogy means the earth can't be more than 6,000 or 8,000 years old. That's their starting place. So you just got to know that reading it, because they have so many internet articles. If you do any kind of Googling, and this is the only reason I'm bringing them up, if you do any kind of Googling around evolution and Christianity, their website is going to come up with all the hits. And you just need to know, if you care about science, what they are doing is not science. It's not science. The scientific community would say this is not science, because their starting place. So that's not to say they're bad or anything. I'm just trying to inform and let you know about that. Okay, so the evolution piece. So then I hear pastors saying things about Darwin, yes. I also hear pastors say things like this. I heard a pastor say this a few years ago, close to us. Hey, you may have noticed that monkeys aren't turning into humans anymore. Well, guess that, and if you ask an evolutionist, I'll tell you what they'll tell you about this. They'll tell you that evolution was happening for a long time, but that right now we're on an evolutionary pause. We're on an evolutionary pause. And that one day it'll take off again. This is a real thing a pastor around here said recently. First of all, it is a mischaracterization of evolution to say that if you just went to the zoo and stared at the gorilla long enough, he would turn into a human being, okay? That is not what evolution teaches. Secondly, no one says we're on an evolutionary pause. That goes against the entire theory of evolution. Like, that is not true and not real. I even tried to look up on the internet, evolutionary pause, that phrase, to figure out where did he get this crazy stuff. I couldn't find anything even remotely like it. I assume he may have just made it up. I don't know. This stuff drives me crazy because we as Christians ought to care about the truth. Jesus said that everyone who cares about the truth follows after him. Do not make up stuff about your opponents that they do not believe and then tell everybody how stupid they are. That's the way it comes across. This is what they believe. Isn't that crazy? That would be crazy if that's what they were saying. It's not. So you're the crazy one, right? That's how it feels. Anyway, okay, I got that out of my system, which feels good. So what I want to do for a minute, look, let me try to have a little grace for a second here. It is, kind of our thing as followers of Jesus. Pastors, we're asked a lot of questions about things that we didn't study and major in, right? I mean, you asked me if space aliens are real, as if I should be the one that knows that. I don't know. We're asked a lot of things that and we're supposed to be kind of like experts about things. Like, people look to us for knowledge a lot of times. So sometimes, with very little study, we pull out things, we do the best we can, right? And so I think this is part of where this comes from is someone's desire to be helpful to their congregation, and they probably pulled up Answers in Genesis or a website like that, and we're probably spitting out something that they read, and probably in an inaccurate way that made it even further twisted than what the website said. That's probably what happened. I do have empathy for that. But please always, guys, I know I've said this before, check me on stuff, right? Check me on stuff. Like, sermons are the first word about something, not the last. They are talks that start talks. And so pastors, we need to see if they actually know what they're talking about, because oftentimes I do. But I assume I'm going to misspeak, I'm going to say something wrong, and I'm just going to flat be wrong about some things that I think I'm right about. So that'll happen. Evolution. So I just want to give you a really quick overview of what it says, because I just find that so many times in churches, we don't know what it says, because all we've been given is a straw man version of it over the years. This is very fast, a 30,000-foot overview. Here's 3 things. First of all, that all current species have descended from common ancestors. In other words, it doesn't say that there was a monkey one time and it just became a human being. That's not how that worked. We weren't monkeys at one point and then became not monkeys. We have a common ancestor with gorillas, apes, monkeys, right? If you go back, there's a point at which we were the same and then we diverged on different branches, and humans were one of those branches. That's what evolution says. And then, so theistic evolutionists, people who believe that God created everything and that God's in this, would say that at some point, God grants human beings consciousness to the degree that we have it in a soul and an image, like we're made in his image. And they disagree about the details of that, but they would say that we have a common ancestor. Number 2, changes in species occur gradually over time as a consequence of mutations. This gradually over time thing is where we oftentimes get hung up, because it's hard for us to even imagine the concept of billions of years. I mean, even money-wise, if you had $1 million, you know how far away you are from $1 billion? You're almost $1 billion away from $1 billion if you have $1 million. That's how much $1 billion is. $1 billion is so much, right? And so you've seen, children, they have some characteristics of their parents, and they have some other characteristics that are kind of unique to them. And if you do that over generation after generation after generation for billions of years, you can get different species, is what the theory says and what we've seen borne out, not just in the fossil record, but also, as Francis Collins would show us, even in our DNA, genetically. We can see how different genes mutated, dropped off over time. Did you know most mammals don't need to get vitamin C because their genes provides enough? They don't have to go get vitamin C from extra sources. But we and apes have to go get vitamin C because there's a broken mutation in our DNA. It's the same one that over time we had to get it. We have to go get it for ourselves now. It's become very important for us. And so you either have to believe that God put a broken vitamin C gene in us or that it followed over time. I got a little off track there, but I just want you to know, like, we just see it in a lot of places, but it's gradually over billions of years, and that's why it seems so crazy because we can't even imagine billions of years. Number 3, species change when beneficial mutations allow certain of them to have more offspring than others. This is the whole idea of natural selection. And this is at a 30,000 foot and a bit of an oversimplification. This is what evolution essentially teaches. And so if you hear a pastor say that scientists aren't believing this anymore, more and more are walking away from it, that's just not true. It's not accurate, right? You may not agree with this. You may not believe this is true or this is real or this is what the Bible teaches. But to say that it's losing support would be inaccurate. And so we read this in the language of science and faith. The percentage of scientists who reject evolution is very small. So small that in most large gatherings of scientists, you would not find even one person who rejects the theory of evolution. And almost all Christian biologists accept evolution as well. So I think these books and a couple of other things, I'm oversimplifying a bit here, but these books and some other things that happened, including the Scopes monkey trial in the 1920s, led a lot of Christians in the United States to believe that to be faithful to the scripture, you had to believe that the earth was very young and that evolution wasn't possible. But my problem with these books, it's not just that these books conflict with science, these books also conflict with the Bible. They conflict with the Bible. Like, we are imposing scientific questions on a pre-scientific book. And if you want to know a lot more about this, there's 2 books I want to highly recommend you pick up one or both of them. They're both by John Walton. He's a professor at Wheaton College, an evangelical. He writes The Lost World of Genesis and The Lost World of Adam and Eve. And he does more than anyone else I've read for a layman level to talk through Hebrew cosmology, Hebrew language, and what the words actually would have meant to ancient Hebrews reading these things for the first time. Because these are pre-scientific books, and when we try to bring our scientific questions to them, they were never written to handle those questions. Ancient Hebrew people wouldn't have even known to ask those questions, right? Because it's a pre-scientific community. In fact, what they believed was that the earth rested on top of the oceans, and that when it rained, there was like it says floodgates, waters above the firmament, that there was a dome over the earth with little slots in it, and then when it rained, that was one of the slots being opened up, and that water poured down through the slots, and that's how we got rain. This is how they believe. This is ancient Hebrew cosmology. This, by the way, is not controversial. Like, we know that they would have seen the world this way. And there's nothing in the Hebrew Bible that tries to contradict it or to correct it. It just didn't seem important to God that they understand cosmologically or scientifically how things worked. It just didn't seem important. So, Genesis 1, just real quick, and then we'll be done here in about 3 minutes. So, the word create, bara, it concerns function, not material. In Genesis 1, the word means function and not material. When we think of creation, we think of, yeah, but what is it made out of? And how long did it take to create? But that's not the way ancient Hebrews thought about it. They thought about creation in terms of function. In other words, there was no order. And the Genesis account is God bringing order to no order. So what's the function? Well, day 1 to 3 establishes the function, and then days 4 to 6 installs functionaries. So just a way that looks, in day 1, you have light, day and night, so you have something to control the time. On day 2, you have sky and water separating, so you have the ability to have weather. And on day 3, you have dry ground, which leads to vegetation. So the functionality of days 1, 2, and 3 are time, weather, and food. And then in days 4 through 6, you have functionaries added to the functional spaces that have been created. So sun, moon, and stars. Why does it come days after we have light? Because it's not meant to be taken literally. And so this is placed like the sun, moon, and stars are the functionaries added to the functionality of time. Sea creatures and birds, they're added to the sky and the water. They're the functionaries operating in the spaces that allow for weather. And then land animals and human beings on day 6, on the dry ground. They're the functionaries added to the dry ground to consume the vegetation so that they can eat now that food has been provided in those places. So time, weather, food, and then functionaries to fill those things up, and then God rests on day 7. That's the Hebrew understanding of Genesis 1 and 2. And when we try to impose a 21st century scientific method on it, we are going far beyond what the text was ever meant to support, okay? So, number 4 then, Authorial intent, not literal versus figurative. A lot of times we try to say like, oh, well, does that mean Genesis 1 and 2 is literal or is it figurative? And the reason that debate can get a little tricky is because when I start to ask like, is the Bible literal or is the Bible figurative? It sounds like I can just pick whichever one I want to be true. Oh, it's literal. Why? I like that better. Oh, it's figurative. Why? That sounds better to me. That's not what we want to do. What we want to look for is the intent of the author. So in any particular circumstance, did the author intend for his audience or her audience to understand it literally or figuratively? Like, what was the intent? Let's say a few years from now, we had a nuclear holocaust and most of humanity was killed. Happy Father's Day. All right, so let's say that happens, and then a few humans go underground, and they're underground for centuries as they're waiting for the radiation to clear out, and they eventually come up, and in the wreckage of what used to be human civilization, they're trying to figure out what did we used to be like? What were people like at some point? If you've seen the new Planet of the Apes movie, have that kind of thing in mind, okay? It was good, you should see it. All right, so they're cleaning through it, and let's say they find some of our older writings, and they find, let's say, my letter that I wrote to some friends before I was gonna propose to my wife, Emily, years ago. And in that letter, I told them that I was going to propose to Emily on this particular date, but please don't say or hint at anything yet. Before we get there, I don't want you to let the cat out of the bag. So let's say I use the phrase cat out of the bag. Now, some of you asked me last week why I made fun of cats. And the reason is because they're horrible. That's the biggest reason. But the second reason is because if your cat were big enough, it would eat you. That's just a fact. And if you're honest with yourself, you know that because every cat that's big enough, lions, tigers, mountain lion, like it eats people, right? You're like, no, not my cat. My cat just cuddles me and licks me. Your cat's trying to get a taste of you, okay? And if your cat ever hits a growth spurt, it is gonna make good on the taste it has been going after all these years, okay? But anyway, cats are great. So I use the phrase, don't let the cat out of the bag. And let's say these future people, they don't know that phrase. They don't know that that's a figure of speech to say like, don't tell the secret before we're ready to tell it, right? So they're trying to figure out what do they mean by that. And some people say like, oh, I think it's figurative, or I think it's a figure of speech. Like you mean like don't surprise her early. And so there's another group of people that are like, no, if we want to be faithful to the text of Josh, we have to believe that what he said was absolutely literal. They must have had this ritual back in his day where when you were going to tell someone a really good secret, you would buy a bag and put a cat in it and tie it up and bring it to the person you're going to be like, will you marry me? Cat out of bag, right? Like that was the ritual. And let's say lots of people decide like, oh, that's true. That must be how it worked. So they go out and they start to sell at whatever their version of Target is, bags right next to cats. If you have a big announcement you want to make, you can buy both. And animal activists are like, we're really uncomfortable with that. But the literalists are like, no, these are the ways of our ancestors. We must keep doing the cat out of the bag in order to honor their memory, right? And there's this big fight, this big argument. But what matters is not pick what you like, literal or figurative. What matters is, what did I, the author of the letter, mean when I wrote it? And I meant it figuratively, because it is a figure of speech. Authorial intent, not literal versus figurative, is what we want to look for. And I just believe that if we look back through church history, the authorial intent of Genesis 1 and 2 is that God created. And the scientific specifics, the material specifics of how it created is not what the author is trying to get us onto. So whether you believe in evolution and a 4.6 billion-year-old Earth, or whether you've been convinced that it really matters, that the Earth is much younger than that, and that evolution, humans are somehow outside of that or not a part of that, like I just want us to create space for each other. Like you don't have to believe one thing over the other. I'm just trying to give you a good reason to include those who think differently than you on this issue because this is a peripheral issue and not the central issue of the gospel. Here's my fear. In an effort to make Genesis the science book it isn't, many Christians have become anti-science. Like because we're trying to force a pre-scientific book to be scientific, it's made us like, some of us, not all of us, but some of us really allergic to science in general and really suspicious of it. And that's problematic because people who are already skeptical of Christianity, who believe in the power of science, and science is very powerful and very helpful. Our world is so grateful for it. Like those people don't need to feel like they have to check their brain out the door or ditch their understanding of science in order to come to Jesus. That's an unnecessary barrier between them and the gospel. Billy Graham said this: I don't think that there's any conflict at all between science today and the scriptures. I think that we have misinterpreted the scriptures many times, and we've tried to make the scriptures say things they weren't meant to say. I think that we've made a mistake by thinking the Bible is a scientific book. The Bible is not a book of science. The Bible is a book of redemption. And of course, I accept the creation story. I believe that God did create the universe. I believe that God created man. And whether it came by an evolutionary process, and at a certain point he took this person or being and made him a living soul or not, does not change the fact that God did create man. Whichever way God did it makes no difference as to what man is and man's relationship to God. I'm grateful for Billy Graham for a number of reasons, but I really, really appreciate the fact that he was willing to say, like, this is an issue that people can have different opinions about, and it does not at all dampen the big themes of the Bible, that God, out of his great love for you, created you special. Whether it was through evolution or another process, that's what he did, and he loved you so much, he was willing to lay down his own life for you. I'm gonna ask the band to come up, and they're gonna close us in a song that kind of speaks to this, that speaks to the goodness of creation and the goodness of a process that's unfolded over years and years and years. And so I'm gonna invite you to sing with them, or to soak in what it is that they have to say. And once they've completed this song, they'll dismiss us and you guys can go about your day. I hope that you have a wonderful, wonderful Father's Day. And I hope that you have good discussion over the table as you have lunch about like what it is that faith and science can learn from each other and how they can complement one another as opposed to having to contradict one another. We'll do some more videos because you asked a lot more questions. And next week we'll come back and we'll talk about the questions you asked around the validity of faith. Would you stand together with us as we worship this morning?
Thank you for listening to the Verve City Church Weekly Messages podcast. To learn more about Verve City Church, including info about our church ministries and ways to get involved, visit vervecity.church. To stay up to date with our weekly messages, make sure you subscribe and leave a review so others can find our messages of hope and encouragement. Thanks again for listening. We'll catch you next week.